Start recording. Okay, so today we're going to dive into Winslow Homer. And, we're making good progress. We're in the second half of the 19th century, so that's good. I've taught classes a century of art where I never got past the second decade. So this is working out fairly well. And I want to talk a little bit about the Civil War because Winslow Homer, as we know from the reading that we had on him, is very much sort of deeply involved with the Civil War. So we want to sort of talk about that a little bit. As you know, it broke out in 1861 was the beginning of the Civil War. And for our purposes here in this class, when the Civil War broke out in 1861, it was the first war to be documented with photographs. And that's only just, there wasn't a choice. It was just that they were available because photography is a relatively new art. And we've had the opportunity to talk about photography in this class a couple times, right? In particular, looking at Bierstadt. We ended up talking a bit about photography, also with Moran. Early photography was an unwieldy thing, right? It was very difficult to take photographs, not as easy as it is now, because early cameras were monsters. They're big, right? And you know this, that the word camera just means room, right? Camera. And so, Kammer in German, right? A camera is the Latin word for room. And that's because original cameras were basically a very large box, right? And it comes from the fact that the principle that you can turn any dark room into a projection system. It's very easy to do. We can do it in here, right? All you need is a totally darkened space open to something bright and a hole in one surface, and you can then add a lens to sharpen it, but that will project an image on the opposite wall. Okay? So even right now, if you look at the back wall, you can see some of the color from outside coming in, right? Because we've got basically that going back there. It's just a very big hole, okay? So it's a big hole means it's going to be a blurry picture, right? But if it were a smaller hole, we would get a fairly accurate picture on the far wall. So it's a cool principle, right, of how that works. The dark room, right? And so a camera is a way of working with that, where you simply put some photosensitive, in other words, light-sensitive paper on the wall opposite the aperture, the opening, right? Now, early cameras, I think we talked about this a bit. Early cameras had very, very small apertures because it gave you a very sharp picture, right? Even though a bigger aperture would let more light in, it tended to be less focused, right? You would need more lenses to make that work, the bigger the aperture got. But one of the principles of photography is that the bigger the aperture, the less exposure time you need. That's great, right? Think of a fire hose versus a garden hose and how long it would take to fill a bathtub, right? So it lets more light in, which means it takes less time to get the paper to the point that it has the exposure it needs, right? Smaller needs to be open longer, and most early cameras were smaller because what happens is that smaller is sharper than big, right? This is why when you, Thomas, without your glasses, right, if I do this and I squint really hard, I can kind of begin to bring things into focus by squinting, right? And it's because what I'm doing is I'm sharpening the hole, right, of my little cameras inside my eyes, right? Okay. The other thing that happens with photography is that with the really small hole, not only do you need a longer aperture opening, that stay open longer because it needs to let all that light in. But what happens with the sharpness is that it gives you what's called depth of field. And in both of these pictures, you can see that. The depth of field means that everything from the rocks in the foreground through the camp, through the city in the background is more or less in equal focus, right? The train with the rocks, the coal on the train is in pretty much the same focus as where the tracks disappear. It's depth of field, right? whereas a bigger opening has less depth of field. Only certain parts of it would be in focus. And you see this in movies sometimes, where they'll focus in and then everything's blurry in the background, right? Okay. Early cameras had extraordinary depth of field, right? Very, very thin, very, very small openings, long exposure times, and great depth of field. So when we looked at Bierstadt's pictures, those wonderful landscapes, he has that same sort of extraordinary depth of field, right? That's mimicking the effects of photography. Back to the Civil War. When the photographers, this army of photographers, right, embedded with the war, and it's very much like, remember this from the Iraq War, that there were reporters embedded with the troops. These photographers were embedded with the troops, going out to record the war. The problem was this aperture. To get a good picture, you had to leave the shutter open for a very, very long time, which meant that it was impossible, absolutely impossible, to capture moving subjects. So most of our images of the Civil War are images not of the battles, right, but images of the periphery of the war, the times between the battles. That's really what we get to see. So encampments, trains being loaded, and you can even see as we look at various people here, him, for example, they've turned their head, their faces just blur out because they did so much as just do this, right? And so when we see portraits from this time, you probably noticed there was a little metal thing behind your neck to hold the neck in place, so that you'd have to sit for 30 seconds, flinching, right, in order to get a good picture. But numerous of these fellows, this guy's hat, for example, are blurring because of that, right? So the only blur that we see is not because of depth of field, but because of motion. Okay? And this means that our Civil War memories, if you will, our Civil War recordings that we have through photographs like this by Matthew Brazen, most famous of the group, tend to not show us the war itself, but what's going on around the war, right? The elements that lead up to it. And in many ways, these are sort of like, rather than action scenes, they're sort of scenes of everyday life, right? What it's like to be in the battle. And the most memorable of these images, of the things that don't move, are the images of the war dead. These are easily the most memorable images that came back from the Civil War. So this is actually Hagerstown's Road on the left. I imagine probably, it might be, is that 17, 19 out there that leads down past Antietam? In any event, Antietam battlefield, right? The dead don't move. So that part of the battle we can document, right? But nothing of the battle itself, only once they stop moving, right? So these are easily the most memorable photos from the war, the motionless dead. And the focusing on the dead is not only so that we remember the lesson of war, hopefully never do it again, right? The price of war. But in addition to that, photographers are forced to search for non-moving subjects. On the cracks in the one on the right, the negatives that were being exposed were glass, right? Rather than we have them on different kinds of plastic, right? We don't anymore, we have them in pixels. But back in the day, right, film was nitrate and whatnot. But prior to that, they were actually glass negatives, and so sometimes these would crack, as you see with Brady's photo on the right, right? Now, these went on display. They weren't just sort of documentary photographs for newspapers and media, but rather they were displayed like art. And we have numerous accounts of people looking at photographs in the 19th century, both war photographs and otherwise, and marveling at the realism. That's the prominent comment, is the ability to look into the photograph closely, better than we can do here because they pixelate out, and see every blade of grass all the way to the horizon. And viewers in photography exhibitions were given magnifying glasses with which they would then get as close as they could to it, and would spend time immersing themselves in this extraordinary detail. Right? And the Library of Congress where most of these come from, has pretty good high-resolution images of these that you can do that with, right? Of these photos. And so there would be photography exhibitions. And with the Civil War, there were obviously exhibitions devoted to images of the war, right? And reviews of these shows talked about the sort of impact that they had, that they brought home to us the terrible reality of war. This is a quote from a review of one of the Brady shows. They brought the bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along our streets. So what the photographer is trying to do is to make sure that the people who live in the cities who are benefiting from, well, ostensibly, benefiting from stopping the rebellion, are indeed made aware of the cost, right, of war. The bodies are laid at our streets, right, laid at our dooryards. And the reviewer went on to talk about the fact that the people looking at the pictures were hushed reverend groups standing around these weird copies of carnage, right? So great interest in these. One might argue that it's almost a prurient interest in them, a sort of lurid kind of interest in them, right? Matthew Brady had a whole army of photographers who worked with him. Timothy O'Sullivan is one of these team of photographers. Another of the team of photographers is Alexander Gardner, and this is probably the single most famous image. And then we can talk a little bit about depth of field, right? See the horse in the background? Even though it looks somewhat misty, it's sort of moving off and out of focus in the way that the foreground is less in. It must have a larger aperture, right? Now, Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan ended up becoming a team. They divorced themselves from Brady and staved out on their own. Gardner began working for Brady. He ran Matthew Brady's Washington, D.C. branch of the Matthew Brady Photography Studios, and then branched out on his own to open his own gallery, which was down on 7th and Penn, Northwest, which I find fun now that I'm here to sort of talk about these things directly. And he was able to gather some of his friends who had worked under Brady to come with him, and O'Sullivan was one of them. And what Gardner then did, especially with the Civil War photos, is he published them in a book, tipped in, right? This is before printing allowed us to print pages with photos. So you'd actually get a photographic impression, and this would then be glued in or sewn in to the page of the book. And he called it Gardner's Photographic Sketchbook of the War, right? Obviously, calling it a sketchbook suggests artistic merit, right? And that's certainly part of it. It's not his photographic documentary of the war. It's his photographic sketchbook of the war. And the idea, I think, is that the different images together bring in, like sketches do, different themes that you, the viewer, bring together into your idea about the war itself. And this was published after the war was over in 1866. So they assembled their backlog of work, made new prints, and published them together, right, under Gardner's aegis. And O'Sullivan is one of the photographers that's published in this book. And when they publish it, when Gardner publishes these, in addition to having the photograph, there would be a caption underneath it, a sort of a lengthy caption, not just the title, but a quite lengthy explanation of the image. And he actually retitled the images as well. And so the one on the left, when it appeared in the book, right, when he first took it in 1963, right, very documentary. Battle of Gettysburg, bodies of the dead Federal soldiers on the field of the first day's battle. Okay. But when it appeared in Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war, the harvest of death, right? And we read about this when we were reading about Winslow Homer, right? The importance of the harvest metaphor at that time, particularly after the war, right? That the blood soaked the soil, yada, yada, yada. That came out of that reading, right? So its title was not the original title that Alexander Gardner had assigned to this work, right? But a title that it picked up through the course of time. The Harvest of Death in Gettysburg, PA. And I don't have the entire inscription here, but I wanted to read sort of a little bit of what was written underneath it, just to give you a sense of the spirit of how that worked, right? Slowly over the misty fields of Gettysburg. And so our depth of field issue is also enhanced by mist. Okay? Slowly over the misty fields of Gettysburg, through the shadowy vapors, it was indeed a quote-unquote harvest of death that was presented. A battle has been often the subject of elaborate description, but it can be described in one simple word: devilish. Right? In other words, it's countering that heroic war theme, right? War as heroism, war as great men, right? The battle has often been the subject of elaborate description, but there's only one word for it, right? Satanic, devilish, he says. And the distorted dead recall the ancient legends of men torn in pieces by the savage wantonness of fiends. Such a picture conveys a useful moral. And all of them had morals, right? Not just look, but learn. Such a picture conveys a useful moral. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to its pageantry. Here are the dreadful details. Let them aid in preventing another such calamity falling upon the nation. Right? These are instructive images. They are intended to ensure, as we look at the horror of the rotting faces, right, the skin drawn tight, that we never let something like this happen again. So this is how the war was understood, right? And in addition to photographers going out to the front, documenting not the battle itself, but the scenes around it, there were also a group of artists that were dispatched to document the war as well, and Winslow Homer was one of them. And that's who we're going to be focusing on for the next couple days. They were part of this war reporting team, again, embedded with different regiments during the war, right? Part of, and in many ways, we can see this idea of the artist as a reporter, right? An artist as someone who documents. Being a different kind of idea about the artist than we're used to today. All we have to do is think about Moran and Bierstadt being asked to accompany survey teams, right? Because their artistic input was as important to the team as the scientific input that might have come from the geologists, right? And even though they had photographers there to document everything, they wanted the artists' input as well. And Homer is kind of the same idea, right? In addition to photographers documenting the war as it happens, Homer's out there making sketches, right? At various places within the war. And he's working in particular for one magazine who's hired him to send him out as their journalist, if you will, right? The artistic equivalent of a photojournalist. And this was Harper's Weekly, which was around when I was a kid. I don't think it's around anymore. Most magazines aren't around anymore, really, right? Anyway, the internet killed everything, right? But Harper's Weekly was still around in the 60s and 70s. And that's who is his employer on this. In fact, most of Homer's prints were printed in Harper's Weekly. And the reason they wanted Homer is not only this idea that artists had something to add to the narrative, but also printing processes, right? To print the journal didn't have the technology to print photographs yet, right? Photographs could only be seen on a wall in a photo studio, right? They could not be reproduced by mass media. But Homer's engravings can, right? So this is a print. This is a wood engraving. I don't think we've seen any prints in this class, have we? Did we talk about prints at all in this class? Right? A wood engraving is very much like a metal engraving. Okay, so printmaking processes, there's two different basic categories of printmaking. Right? One of them, woodcut, is earlier, older in European history, and non-Western as well. And with, it's on the board, right? With woodcut, with printmaking, printmaking relies on the fact that any surface, if it's varied, will hold ink on certain parts and not the others. Right? That's the number. So if this surface is missing bits, and you roll ink across the top of it, you can transfer that ink to a piece of paper. Okay? It's called relief printing. So in relief printing, what you do is you carve out the white parts, and you leave the mount tops to take the ink that you roll onto some sort of roll. Okay? That's relief printing. Marymount in a nutshell. Relief printing. Okay? Now, the same process, if you rub ink into the grooves and polish off the top, leave the ink here. Right? It's called intaglio printing, an Italian word. It's the exact opposite, but each of them relies on the fact that the varied surface of the block will print, okay? So intaglio prints are things like etchings and engravings. Or intaglio prints. Okay? Each of them relies on the fact that this varied surface can be rubbed with ink in some way, and a piece of paper can be placed on it and then removed with the design that you've made transferred with ink. Okay? Relief printing, you carve away the whites, you leave the blacks. Right? In intaglio, you carve the blacks. And what you do is you push the ink down into those grooves, you polish off the flat parts, ink stays in the groove, paper goes on top, printing press, it comes out of the grooves. Right? Sarah's got some on the wall outside right now, some wonderful prints of Istanbul that were done with basically the same process. Okay? This is a wood engraving, and a wood engraving is somewhere in between the two. Most engravings, like carved, engraved, plus ones, are on a metal plate. Usually copper, but sometimes lead, right? Is the metal that's used for engraving. These days we use these plastic plates that are so much easier to carve, right? In Athens, when I was a printmaking major, right? A wood engraving takes a wood block on end, so you're looking cross-section of the rings, sands it really smooth, and then does the same engraving process with wood rather than metal. Right? It's a wood engraving. It's basically the same process. You're cutting into that piece. And if you do it on end and the rings structure is tight enough, you can get the same sort of effect that you would get off of a metal plate. Right? Now these are printed in the same way that offset printing is printed, right? Put it in there, put the block in with the text around it, and off comes the paper with the printing for the magazine, right? But like I said, they didn't have the process for photographs, right? Mechanical reproduction of photographs for print didn't come into like 1910 or something like that. It's really late, right? There's technology for that. So Homer is dispatched, full circle, right? Back out of the lab. Homer is dispatched to the front to provide eyewitness images for Harper's Weekly, the magazine, because with photographs they can't print those, right? They want images to go with it. And they trust Homer's ability to transcribe this accurately in the same way that the survey teams trusted Bierstadt and Moran, right? Artists were trusted to have this realism, okay? So Homer goes out. Now, process, right? It's not that he's sitting there watching the troops and he's got a piece of wood that he's carving, right? What he does is he goes out and he makes sketches, just hundreds of sketches. And then he goes back into the studio, back and forth from the city to the front. Goes back into the studio and uses the sketches that he's made to come up with the final composition. But the sketches are what's made on site, okay? So the work of art we're seeing is like Bierstadt's landscapes cobbled together from things that he has seen wall at the front. The sketches are wonderful. I mean, he's such a... One of the things I really like, I like Homer a lot. One of my human figure. He understands sort of how the body articulates and how weight shifts and holds. The guy on the left, right, and you can tell it's done incredibly quickly. Jam it down, and yet the proportions are just right. The shifting of the weight. There's a naturalism to how he draws that's just extraordinary. I think he's just really, really good. I wish I could draw the human figure as well as Winslow Homer can, and the sense of three-dimensional space. So the soldiers playing cards, and again, I think his interest is shared or maybe even informed by photography, because from Homer we don't actually see much in the way of battle scenes either. He too likes to record the mundane activities that happen around battle. People standing around, people goofing off in between the theaters of war, playing cards, right, smoking a pipe. But if we look at the pose of the fellow on the right with his ankle turned toward us, we see the bottom of his shoe, you realize that's not an easy pose to pick up. And there's parts of the articulation, this shin is a bit long, but it works, right? It sits in space, and you understand it doesn't look like you have to break any bones to make these soldiers sit where they are. Right? The guy across from him, his body's a little oddly articulated with the shirt untucked, right? It doesn't work quite, but it still has a sense that he really understands the human form. My next slide is, there we go. Right. Here, the drawing on the left, hanging around at Sutler's tent, even translates the Sutler into the print, and there's the wood engraving that he made from it, which is Thanksgiving in camp. Right? Capturing these moments between battle. And that's really what Homer focuses on in his prints from the war, is the human side of war. Right? And I don't think, so far as I know these, and I haven't looked at everyone because there are thousands of these, right? But the ones that I've seen, you don't see much in the way of documenting the dead. It's really about the life around the war. And the titles that he gives them, right? Originally, it's more for a documentary, Sutler's Tent, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. When it becomes a print, it becomes Thanksgiving in Camp. He adds a little narrative to it to make it a little bit more nostalgic. Tug at your heartstrings, right? Make it a little bit more emotional, so that the readers of Harper's Weekly can say, "Oh, it's not just any old day, but read something more into the picture, right? Understand it a bit better, or at least engage with it a bit more deeply." Well, as you might imagine, this experience at the front leads him to begin to make paintings of the Civil War as well. And in fact, I think that I've read that this is his very first Civil War painting. And as you can see, Civil War is 1861 to 65. We are right in the middle of the war when this is painted. We don't know exactly when; it's not dated. But our Homer experts out there are pretty sure that this is very much the very, very first Winslow Homer painting of the war. Okay. Again, he's giving us these scenes of everyday life, moments between the battle, rather than the battle itself, so that he can focus on the human protagonists and really their day-to-day activities. Home sweet home. So it focuses on our two soldiers in the foreground. And as we look at it more closely, we see directly behind them, some nice details of this, right? The military band playing the song that is the title of the picture, Home Sweet Home. And across the field, that's the field of battle behind those spindly trees. On the opposite side, by the rising hill in the distance, with the rising smoke behind it, that's the enemy camp, right? Those are the rebel soldiers on the other side. Okay? So what we're looking at is the field of battle from one side across to the other. And what we're seeing is a custom that took place during the Civil War, where in between battle, there would be these volleys of music back and forth, kind of like at a college football game, you know? Each side brings the band, and each side plays their thing, right? So they're sort of volleying back and forth music, and the other side is hearing them, and then they would stop and they would hear the music waft from the enemy camp back and forth, right? But the figures in the foreground are the ones that are doing the primary listening. They're hearing their band play loudly, right? Loud enough that it can be heard across the field, but they're listening to the song Home Sweet Home. And what Homer does with this image is he engages us with what's going on in their minds. We don't see their eyes. We don't see much in the way of details on their faces, but they're pondering nostalgically the lyrics of this song, thinking about Home Sweet Home, right? So there's a sort of romantic tugging at your heartstrings here, where our soldiers at the front, right, are longing for warm beds, right? They're longing for hearth and home as they hear this song. And Homer focuses in front of them on their current home, right? So he's juxtaposing the memory of home, the idealized comfort of the home they left behind, with the home that they have now, the tent, right? The simple toasts on the metal plate, right? The pot of beans. I'm making that up. On the fire, right? Whatever that pot of is on the fire. Again, the sense of realism is fantastic, right? Homer's a great observer, as all of our American artists have been, going back to the Peale family. Fantastic observers. But the question is maybe this is Home Sweet Home. You know? Maybe they're thinking, okay, well, this is what I've got right now. But Homer sort of leaves it open-ended. The juxtaposition between the home they've left behind to join the army and the home that they currently occupy now that they've taken up the duty. Right? Slightly closer image of this. Homer, embedded with the troops, saw this, right? He was there. And in fact, he couldn't just be there making doodles and sketches and whatnot. They put him to work, right? Now, he's not enlisted with the army, so what's he going to do? He's not taking up arms. He became a kitchen hand while he was with the army, and he was washing dishes for the troops. And people suggested, well, this kind of interest in the tin pots and the food on the plate might reflect Homer's job, his real job as an embedded member of the troop. So here's Homer again parlaying his Civil War experience into various kinds of works of art, right? Some for publication, but others as works of higher art. This is exactly how we get around to the veteran in the new field that we talked about before. After the war ends, Homer continues to be very much interested in these images of soldiers and the impact of the Civil War on us as a country, right? In this case, we have one of the rebel soldiers, as we read, hoeing the field with a scythe. He has his military canteen off to the right amid the field. There's a certain almost Keith Haring-like jitteriness to above the side here. Right? I don't know if that's intended to look as if he's cut those areas back little by little, but it gives you that staccato rhythm to make you think that the side is in motion. Homer is really terrific with applying paint. And by that I mean he's very avant-garde in a way. He's, for all of the closeness of observation that we see in his works, right? The closely observed pots, the field in the background. When we look closely at the paint, and in the veteran new field we can see this, there's quite a looseness to how he's putting the strokes of paint on the canvas. not trying to, with every stroke, make it look as if the brush has disappeared. Does that make sense? Right? Many times I would Thomas Kuhn, right, with Bierstadt. You are hard pressed to find the brush stroke because there's this enamel-like finish to where there's this artifice that you're not looking at a painting, but you're looking at the actual thing, right? And that's some of the great charm of Bierstadt and Moran is the sense that you're looking at the actual thing, that you're immersed in it, right, like a photograph. That's documentary. But Homer keeps calling attention to the fact that you're looking at a painting. Because when you look at things like the wheat in the foreground of the veteran, go back an image here, right? The smoke rising from the fire, the charred wood. You spend enough time looking and you see the individual brush strokes. You see that he's not blending them so that it's seamless, but that he's, look at especially the ground between the two pots. And it's just a series of patches of paint, right? Very, very avant-garde. This is a style of painting that actually got him some criticism. In fact, many people didn't like it in the 1860s. This is a style of painting that we often associate with Impressionism. They're starting in France at this point, but he hasn't been there yet. He hasn't seen it. Right? He doesn't get to France until 1866. So this is before he ever went. He's sort of already moving in the same direction. I don't know how or why. I don't know if there's a cause and effect here. Right? But he's very forward-looking. He's very avant-garde in his manipulation of the medium, in his application of paint. Right? And not everybody liked this about his works. Right? Now, I do want to sort of talk a bit about Homer in relation to sort of major art movements in the middle of the 19th century. And we did this when we talked about Bierstadt, Moran, and the Church. We started talking about Romanticism, right, as a theme, and how the international interest in Romanticism informed these American painters, right? So their interest in the power of nature, right, was something that was not unique to American painting, but part of a broader international romantic movement. Well, Homer in the Civil War is painting at a time when the romantic movement, while still continuing, and really continues to the end of the 19th century, is starting to be replaced, certainly joined, but eventually replaced by a movement called the Realist movement, which begins in 1846, 1848 in Paris. Now, it has nothing to do with realism versus abstraction. That's not the issue. The issue for the realist painters is paintings of real life. That's the realist part. Paintings of real life. And it came out of a rallying cry for painters, starting in France, to paint the world around them, rather than make allusions to it through mythology. Right? So stop painting narratives from Shakespeare. Stop painting ancient Roman scenes, even if they're meant to parallel what's going on today. What you should be painting instead is everyday life. And there were some paintings that did treat everyday life, but they were usually major battles taking place, right? Major events in the life of a ruler or a leader. But this rallying cry was real life of the common man. Everyday occurrences, everyday activities. Show what life is like here and now so that people in future generations, looking back at us, can see not only what life is like, but what was great about it. It wasn't just to report on it, but to show it as something almost heroic about day-to-day activities. What was great about being alive in the 19th century? And Homer's painting in that exact period. So our image of Home Sweet Home, our image of the veteran in the new field, should be sort of thought about as sort of championing mundane, everyday activities and finding within that some sort of greater humanity, something memorable, something worthwhile documenting. And this had been going on in French art already for a while. It started in 1846 when Charles Baudelaire wrote a review of the annual Salon. We talked about salons before, right? The French Royal Academy sponsored biennial shows of works by its members. Every now and then they'd be annual, but mostly biennial. Right? Works by its members were juried, thousands of works on the walls. Right? People showed up in droves. It was a major social event. And it was attended by critics as well as just the viewing populace. And the criticisms were published, and more people read them than you might imagine today. It's more important. Baudelaire had been writing reviews of the Salon year in and year out, and they're fairly thorough because the Salon is huge, right? Thousands of pictures. And he'll single out the things he wants to talk about. He didn't write about every single picture. So if you can get mentioned by Baudelaire or any of the other critics, that's a good thing, right? In addition to the opportunity to sell your stuff. In 1846, Baudelaire goes to the Salon. And he writes this 100-page review, right? And in the review, he talks about the fact that amongst all of the pictures he's seen, very few of them are worthwhile because most of them are mythological scenes or historical scenes. None of them, he says, are illustrating what it's like to be alive today. And that we need to document this for future generations in the same way the Romans documented their lives that so many artists are now picking up on and regurgitating. Right? What are people in future generations going to look back at? Baudelaire said. 1847, big review. He said in this, there was one artist, and he's sort of a minor artist these days. We don't really talk about him very much, except as the subject of Baudelaire's review. And not many of his works have survived. But he labels him the painter of modern life. And in a nutshell, that's what realism is. The painting of modern life. And he says this is something that more people should be doing. Giving us paintings of modern life. And this turns out to have happened at a particularly momentous time in European history, 1846. Because the next Salon, 1848, coincides with the Third French Revolution. The Third Revolution in France. And the third, I'm not going to get into French history, right? French had 3 different revolutions, plus a war that kind of worked like a revolution later. Okay? So the first revolution you all know about, right? Off with their heads, all that stuff. That's 1789. That led to Napoleon. Long story short. He was deposed, not in a revolution, went back to the monarchy. Second revolution against that monarchy, 1830. Right? They then tried a parliamentary-style British government with a king and a parliament. The king got more and more tyrannical. He was deposed in 1848 in the Third Revolution. Okay? Now, the Third Revolution, one of the things that brought the Third Revolution about was a sense that the king, and this happens with most revolutions, a sense that the king was not engaged or concerned with the common man. in particular the rural poor, the people working in the countryside. And one of the things that came out of the Third Revolution in 1848, 2 years after Baudelaire's review, was a series of social programs that were intended to directly benefit those who worked manually, usually in the countryside, but still suffered. What do we call them today? Title payback. Right? Okay? So there's a renewed focus on modern life, on the plight of the rural poor at exactly this time. Right? The other thing that makes this a particularly momentous period is another thing that happens in 1848, which is the publication of the Communist Manifesto, all about class difference, class struggle, and the rights of the working man. These things all come together so that a review, which could have just been an art review in 1846, ended up taking on this bigger role in really almost overnight changing avant-garde French art. Right? The most forward-looking French art in 1848 became a series of painters who put out works that were focusing on mundane activities in the everyday life of rural folk, farmers in their communities, manual laborers. And on a scale massive, that was usually reserved for aristocrats and kings, right? Elevated status. Okay? This is the realist movement, right? Begins 1848, more or less, although arguably the roots are Baudelaire in 1846. Okay? The 1846 Salon was where Catlin showed this, right? This portrait of Buffalo Bull's backpack that we looked at before was in the 1846 Salon. Baudelaire saw this picture. I don't know if he commented directly on it, but here is somebody documenting contemporary life, right? And it's interesting to think about this work as being something that might have led to this movement, right? So again, dates in mind, right? 46, Baudelaire writes the review. 48 are the first works of art that are shown in the Salon that are ostensibly realist. I think our American artists have kind of already been on that boat. I didn't do that on purpose, right? It just happened. Bingham's Jolly Flat Moment, same year, not in Paris or anything, but obviously deeply interested in the wonder, the thrill, the joy, the heroism of everyday working class folk, right? So when Baudelaire writes this, there's something going on, right? There's something in the air in the 1840s that is changing the focus of art away from a sort of neoclassical interest in antiquity, ancient Rome as a metaphor for the common day, or a romantic interest in the power of nature and landscape, something else, much more down to earth with all of this. No great images of wonder, right? Just to see a few of these French realist works, because I don't presume that some of you have had art history on the art history class, but this is not, there's no prerequisite for this class. But Francois Millet is one of the most prominent of our realist painters, and this gives us a sense of exactly what we're talking about. Images of the rural working poor, right? But trying on a certain level to aggrandize their status, to make them seem so heroic, so these monumental figures against the landscape. But what are they? A gleaner gets to pick the field after it's already been harvested. Right? And it was one of the laws that was set up by the French government after the Third Revolution to help the working poor. What they said was back in the Middle Ages, the peasants could go out and glean the fields after the landlord had harvested it and just sell the grain off, right? They could then pick up what they need to live in the Middle Ages. And in 1848, with the new government coming in after the revolution, they said, let's bring back gleaning. This will help feed the poor. Our hearts are in the right place. But Millet is showing us that it ain't going to work. Because you got all these mounds and mounds and mounds of grain, mountains of grain, and they just barely get anything. We presume they're feeding 3 families, right? So it's about plenty versus lack, right? But at the same time, even though they're bent by the task, they loom in the foreground. They become these big, muscular, monumental figures, right? They have some dignity still. They have some individuality from 3 different headdress colors, right? But at the same time, it's an indictment of this social system. All of our French realist painters are socialists and Marxists, and they really are champions of the working class. Homer, not so much, right? That's not really where he's coming from. The other great realist picture from this period that was destroyed in World War II is the Stonebreakers by Courbet. Courbet and Millet were really the founding fathers of the realist movement in 1848. And there was a Millet picture in the 1848 Salon alongside Courbet's Stonebreaker. Life-size figures chopping at a road in order to level it as it moves through the mountains. They're grading the road, right? So just like today, if you take a highway through the hills, they're going to try and carve it down so you have to go all the way over the top. And this is the idea of smoothing out the road as it goes through the mountain pass, which you see in the background. And they're chopping at the rocks so they can move them out of the way to develop a road. Right? And Courbet's point of view is that this is horrifying hard work, that it leads nowhere. Right? We have a young kid on the left, tatters, carrying out the rocks. We have the older man on the right, probably can't stand up straight anymore, also in rags, breaking up the rocks. This is just work, endless, endless work. And the idea of the endlessness of it is picked up by the cliffs in the background. Right? By the fact that we have young and old side by side doing the same activity. The only future for the kid is what the old man was. Right? And they're one with their work. It's hard to even tell their boots from the rocks around them. This is horrible labor. And they're making a road that they themselves would probably never use. A road that would connect this rural area with the capital, so that carriages can move more quickly between the city and countryside. But they're country folk. This isn't for them. They're working like this for somebody else. Right? And that adds to this overall sense of the horror of the scene. So realism, right, as it gets going in France, is very much this movement where works of art are focusing on mundane everyday activities, right? The modern world, but a particular kind of view of the modern world. Homer fits into this. Views of the modern world. Mundane everyday activities. But what's different about Homer, maybe what's American about Homer, he's not as politically motivated. He's not trying to change society. He's not trying to open people's minds to a particular injustice that is about class difference. He's not a Marxist, right? Courbet was a card-carrying Marxist. The Marxists love this picture, right? The Marxists, the Socialist Party of Paris says this was the greatest illustration ever of the danger of capitalism, right? Of one people working for the benefit and profit of somebody else. The standard Marxist standard critique of capitalism. Right? They love this. But when we look at Homer, even though he's every bit as engaged with everyday activities and often in the countryside, usually in the countryside, we don't get that same interest in singling out some social injustice that has to be corrected. Right? We don't get the same sense of a socio-political undercurrent to his works. It's much more documentary. Maybe that comes out of his Civil War experience, right? Because his job was to balance the boat. But as we look at the rest of his works, we'll see that they're very sort of straightforward images of rural life, but without any of the French highlighting of injustice. It's just not, it doesn't seem to be part of it. So, Home Sweet Home is the very first of these Civil War pictures. We're very lucky at the National Gallery, or maybe not because it's hard to get through all the material. We've got a lot of Homers. Very, very good Winslow Homer collection at the National Gallery, both paintings, but also prints, drawings, watercolors. He's really very, very, what do I want to say, productive artist. So here we have an image of a woman on a farm. Fits into this French realist theme that we were talking about. Blowing a horn for people to come to dinner, for the workers in the fields to come have the dinner that the family, the owners of the farm, have prepared for them. And it's identified for us quite clearly as a farm, more that than as the seaside part of things. There's really nothing here to suggest seaside, by the details around her. Homer, because he began working with prints in the Civil War, likes the ideas of treating themes repeatedly, right? In the same way that he took his drawings and made a print from them, usually when he happens on a theme that he wants to illustrate, he's never happy with only doing it once. He wants to explore the theme and see what of its possibilities are. And so this is one of, I saw 4 or 5 different ones of these. This is in Boston, right? And it's very much exactly the same theme. We have the house on the left, vines growing up it. It's much sketchier, significantly smaller. We have the farm hands in the background on the right, and the woman blowing the dinner horn in almost exactly the same pose, right? Hand on her hip, and face seen from the side. And again, I think this interest in repeating themes comes out of his start as a newspaper illustrator. Wonderful details included in the background, and again, we can talk about the bravery. By this time, he'd been to Paris, right? He went to Paris in '66, so he's already been. He's visited. He's seen. At that point, Monet is working, Manet is working, Pissarro. All of the impressionists are working, and you can see that the chickens in the field beneath her elbow are picked out with just the most brief notation of paint, right? But also, if you look at her elbow, you can see the degree to which he brings, to get the sense of the blue light of the sky traipsing across her figure. He brings in these shots of blue, even into the pink of her arm, and sometimes even juxtaposes them directly against its opposite on the color wheel, so that blue and pink sort of vibrating in your retina and making the flesh seem that much more alive. On the opposite side of her, we see the field with the workers, the resting cow, again, briefly drawn, but totally accurate in a way. The fellow plowing with a horse at the edge of the field, the mountains of grain, and the workers who are now sort of perking up to listen to the call, to leave their work and then come in for dinner. The focus is on the horn blower, and as we look at her, you'll notice how willowy that dress is. In fact, parts of it are see-through, not to her nude body or anything, but there are parts of it where, in fact, you can see through the gauze. She stands with her hands on her hip, her heels together, and as you follow the ankle, which, by the way, seeing even that ankle was a little bit risque in the 19th century, even though she has boots on. And there's sketches of him of women's legs with just the boots. He seems to have been sort of into that, right? But as you follow her legs up, you can see just a little trace of flesh tone underneath the dress. It's either sun or the blue. And he's caught up with a sort of eroticism of the outline of her shape being very obvious under all elements of this, that the call to supper has a certain um, uh, erotic charge to it. And many of Homer's images of rural life have a sort of, I don't want to say erotic's not the right word, this one kind of is, but many of them are a much more simple kind of romance. And I don't mean this romantic romance, right? Romantic movement romance, but simple romance in the countryside. And that here he gives it a charge that her beckoning to them is given a certain erotic undertone. I read when I was doing some research on this to get ready for class that the upended milk jug laying next to the pots where the ivy is growing was in fact used in 19th century art and earlier as a metaphor for sexual uh, wantonness, the idea of spilled milk. You sometimes see upended jugs, you sometimes see broken milk glasses, all of them related with the spilling of the fluid outside of its container to an overall theme of eroticism. And Homer seems to be picking up on that here. Homer was a fantastic watercolor painter as well. Watercolors are fairly recent in American art, and this is a combination of transparent watercolor and gouache, which is opaque. And he actually belonged to a newfound group called the American Watercolor Society that only uh, formed in the late 1860s. And he gives us here another image of rural life with a romantic overtone. And as we read the picture, it's just sort of a charming romantic overtone, I think. There's a farmhand been out working, pitchfork on his shoulders, pausing to chat up a woman inside the farmhouse. Probably the maid, based on how she's dressed, with the little white hat and the stripes. But there's something afoot here between the two of them. As he calls it, a rustic courtship, right? In their day-to-day activities, and again, very much in keeping with the realist movement, he's finding these moments, these downtimes, right? And what's going on when nothing's going on. And in this case, this interchange between the woman in the house and the boy outside, and even a sort of a sense of class difference, right, between the two. She's got an elevated position over him. But filled with wonderfully observed details of everyday life. The stuccoed stone ground floor versus the red boards of the building above, the tin of the downspout, its reflections in the shadows, wonderful sunflowers. I absolutely adore that cat, right? And part of me thinks, okay, a cat's, it's on the prowl, isn't it? The cat's looking for some prey. Is there an allegory here, right? Is the woman leaning out the window, the cat looking for prey, right? And found it in our innocent farmhand, who we see from the back, distracted from his duties and about to be caught by the surrogate for the cat who's chasing some sort of vermin in the lower left corner. But how Homer is able, I think, with the smallest of means, to capture so much. Whether it's the shadow he casts into the grass on the right, or just the movement of that cat through the thicket. With just almost nothing, he's able to totally capture the sense of how this plays through. Again, multiples and variants, right? He just loves taking themes and playing with it, working it. It gives you the sense that certainly that house must have been painted or drawn from observation, from direct observation, and then moving around it, either in his mind or in reality. Good artists don't need to set up the easel or sketch pad in a different way to imagine something they've drawn from a different point of view. In fact, through the history of art, we can find numerous drawing exercises where the student is given one view and asked to draw it from a different point of view. What would this look like from the other side? What would this look like from the right? And I don't think Homer, to draw this house as accurately as he has, is obviously intended to be the same house. I don't think he has to move to the other side to do it. I think he can do that in his head. I think that's just something that is part of his facility. Right? Something for you guys to work on as well, right? Imagine things from the opposite side. Lots of images of farm life that don't have anything to do with romance and courtship have to do with sort of dutifully fulfilling your daily chores, farm maid gathering eggs from the barn on the left, another tending to a sick chicklet on the right, all about sort of proper activities and a sort of a virtue in a job well done, in the care given to the works. Again, combinations of transparent watercolor and opaque gouache painting. But even with these, we can see what we saw in the oil pictures, which is the degree to which Homer suggests and the degree to which he leaves things unresolved. I love the opening of the door in the background, which is the white of the paper, right? And you can see the pencil line where he's drawn it in. And then in order to get the bright light of the barn door that opens to the great beyond, it's just the white of the paper that he hasn't touched with anything. Or how he handles the hay in the foreground. You can see how with the transparent watercolors brought the tones down and sort of masked in that mound of hay above the chicken, above the rooster on the right. And then come back with the opaque gouache on the top and just flashed in the highlights of the individual strands. All of that comes out of years of observing, because to get it right to where it's convincing as a series of disjointed strokes is absolutely impossible, and there's a million ways to screw it up to make it look unconvincing at all. Look at what he's done on the wall between the beams on the right. It's almost like he's just sort of splattered it or something with some black paint that's not meant to suggest anything maybe other than the mold growing on the wall. There's not a direct relationship between the pigment on the surface and any definable thing. This is really brave for the 1870s as a mode of painting. He's even got some of that splattering going on in the front on her bib, right, where he's put a toothbrush in and scattered some paint on it to give it that effect of that rough, nappy fabric that she's wearing. I think the use of water-based paints has sort of freed him up to do some really incredible things when it comes to how he handles paint. These are probably intended to be moralizing in the same way they always have been, right? There's something about these scenes that is tended to sort of be more than just a documentation of life on the farm. If we go all the way back to the 17th century, Vermeer in particular, but others as well, we see these images of rustic servants at work, intended to be images of domestic virtue, right? Of the pride and the strength of character that comes from a job well done. Even a simple job like pouring milk or gathering eggs, you know, you're given a duty, you do it. There's something to be said for the moral character, the heroism, for lack of a better word, of that particular act. And that we all have the opportunity to be great at something, day in and day out. You know, you don't have to rescue somebody to do it. There's greatness in chores well done. And this remained a theme into the 19th century. Realist painters, this is up in the Walters Museum of Millet, from the Walters, where we can see an amazing similarity between what Homer's doing with his watercolors, with American art, and what realism was to French artists at the same time. Right? This is just an absolute parallel. Homer is a realist painter. A great many pictures focusing on kids, and they're really terrific. He's great with children, these rural images. He had gone off to visit the farm of a friend for a summer in 1878, and he came back with all of these sketches that he had done over the course of the summer in and around that farm. And he's got this portfolio full of watercolors. These are all about like 9 by 14, right? So little, like legal size paper, give or take. And he goes to the American Watercolor Society and he gives them the portfolio. He says, "Do you want a couple of these?" And they put them all up, right? Like dozens of these images. And you can see why, because he's really capturing so much with this. And again, the working process, he starts with just the outlines of elements with graphite, the edges of the fence, for example, edges of the boy's hat, the horizon line of the hill in the background. And then he comes back in with the watercolor to feed into that, to add into it. Right? We could all use to copy a few of these just to figure out how to paint well. And they have an amazing charm, but also sort of innocent courtship about them, as if our rustic courtship that we saw in front of the Red Barn is living out ideas that begin in childhood, right? That this courtship begins at a very, very early phase. The fence is this wonderful metaphor for transition, right? From crossing from one way of thinking to another. And again, this interest in these particular kinds of rural themes are probably very much informed by what he had seen when he went to France and what's going on with French realism and impressionism. And this is just a fortuitous comparison in that they're both in the National Gallery. But Pissarro also gives us these images of rural country life as a wonderful, unspoiled thing, a great place to be, right? Don't you miss the days when you could do that? When your summers weren't caught up with internships and, for me, course prep and curriculum development and all of that. But when you were a kid, summer lasted forever, didn't it? Right? Does it anymore? It is over by the 4th of July, it seems, At that point, you're starting to think of the coming school year. But when I was a kid, I remember summers just like that. I didn't hold hands with any girls, but, walking around and never thinking about time passing. Right? Homer's got this sort of nostalgic view, of what rural life is all about. It's this antidote to the urban world. It's an escape. Right? And that certainly is true for really, I think, so many of our realist and later impressionist artists, is this nostalgic view of the rural countryside. Okay, we'll continue to work with Homer and get to the ocean scenes, which are some of his most famous. Next week, Tuesday. I don't think we have any more breaks in the schedule like we've enjoyed so often in the last one. We'll be able to sort of barrel through the rest of this. Let's see. One other thing is I will get a study sheet up for the final, but probably about 2 weeks in advance of the final. Because it's hard to say where we're going to be, since I never even taught this course before, where we're going to be prior to that. Okay? Good enough. So I will be getting your drafts to you first, and then I'll move from there to your second or your last close reading response, right? In the coming, like the next 24 hours or so, at least for the draft. Okay, I'll see you guys next week.